Hey everybody, it's Dan Harris. Thanks for checking out our video series. Today we're going to be ranking all 32 running back handcuff situations for the 2021 fantasy football season. Now, there are a lot of things that we need to consider when we're thinking about running back handcuffs. Number one, first and foremost, do we even know who the handcuff is? As we'll talk about, for a lot of these situations, we don't. Second, even if we do know who the handcuff is, do they have a chance to supplant the starter if the starter is healthy? Again, for a lot of these guys, they don't. And finally, what is their upside if they find their way into the starter's role, whether it be because of talent or because the person in front of them got injured? So let's work our way through the 32 running back handcuff situations, starting with the worst one to the best one. The best part is that these players, generally speaking, lend themselves to categories, so we will be doing that, starting with a category and then working our way through each situation. So let's start with the first category, which I like to call the we have no idea tier. And let's start at number 32, and that's with the Chargers, where we've got Joshua Kelly, Justin Jackson, and Larry Roundtree. Now, one of these guys is probably going to get a chance no matter what, right? Because we have seen that Austin Ekeler is probably not going to be the goal line back, even though the Chargers have a new offense. But Kelly faltered last year. Justin Jackson always battles injury, and Larry Roundtree was a 6th round pick. We don't know which one of these guys is going to have any value, whether or not Austin Ekeler is healthy. So drafting them really makes no sense at this point. It's just a situation to pretty much avoid entirely. At number 31, let's go to Atlanta and talk about Cordarrelle Patterson or Kadre Allison. No, just no. I mean, I'm excited about Mike Davis. I think you should be too, but that's really because he's the only game in town. Now, Cordarrelle Patterson is talented and has his uses, but it's not as if he's going to supplant Mike Davis for sure. And if Davis gets injured, it's not as if he's going to take over as the primary running back. So that really leaves Allison, who's been quote-unquote impressive in camp. But again, in a low upside offense since they've traded Julio Jones, it's not exactly like the Atlanta running back situation is one to target, absent a guy like Davis who showed last year that he can be a valuable contributor. At number 30, let's go to the Eagles and let's talk about like 50 different running backs. We've got Kerryon Johnson, we've got Jordan Howard, we've got Kenneth Gainwell, we've got Boston Scott if you want to lump him in with the handcuff situation. We don't even really want Miles Sanders right now, and we know that he's going to be the guy because you've got 50 guys waiting behind him, and we have no idea if the coaching staff is going to rotate any of them in. So what are we supposed to think about what happens if Miles Sanders goes down with an injury? The bottom line is we don't want any of these guys on a good day, so we're probably not going to want any of them even if you cleared out Sanders regardless. It's just a situation to avoid unless there are multiple injuries to some of these guys. All right, and finally, let's get to the last one in this tier, number 29 from the Rams. Let's go to Xavier Jones and Jake Funk. Look, before Darrell Henderson got injured, Henderson was a nice sleeper because as much as you wanted Cam Akers to be the guy, we really didn't know if that was going to happen. But the bottom line is, now with Akers out for the season, Henderson by default becomes the guy, and the people behind him are not guys that you can rely on. Now, I personally still expect the Rams to bring in some sort of veteran before the season starts. But either way, we have no idea what happens if Henderson, God forbid, goes down with an injury. I don't see the Rams turning the bulk of the work over to a guy like Jones or a guy like Funk or really anyone. It's going to be a committee approach. And even if the offense is very good, as I expect it to be with Matthew Stafford, I just don't expect any of these guys to have major value. So let's go to the next tier now. And that's going to be something that I call low upside and needs an injury in front of them. Let's start at number 28 with the Giants and Devontae Booker. Now, obviously, Booker is going to have next to no value except maybe in the first game or two, absent an injury to Saquon Barkley. And Barkley was recently taken off the PUP list, which means that he should be good to go by the start of the season, even if he's eased in a little bit. And even if he's injured, the reason we like the Giants running back situation is because of Saquon Barkley, not because of the Giants running back situation. Yes, we saw Wayne Gallman succeed in spurts last year, but there's no way I would be excited about Devontae Booker starting for my fantasy team, even if Saquon Barkley got hurt. At number 27, let's go to New England and talk about Sony Michel. Now, as expected, Damien Harris has been impressive in camp, and he's expected to get most of the work at the running back position. That leaves Michel on the outside looking in, and in fact, he may even be cut before the season starts. Even if he's not, even if he makes that team, and even if there's an injury to Damien Harris, it's not exactly like Sony Michel is going to suddenly light it up for fantasy purposes. The Patriots are probably just going to phase in James White again and see what they have in that type of offense without leaning into Sony Michel, especially if Cam Newton starts the year as a quarterback, which is still expected despite the positive reports about Mac Jones. It's just unlikely that Sony Michel, a guy who's basically on the periphery of the roster, is going to make any sort of impact regardless of what happens to Harris. At number 26, let's go to Pittsburgh and talk about Benny Snell. Now, there is a 0% chance that Snell is going to factor in absent an injury to Najee Harris. It just is. Harris is going to be a workhorse, and if you have listened to any of our podcasts or watched any of our videos, you know that to a man, we are all in on Harris this season. And we have also seen what happens with Snell when there is an injury in front of him, such as what happened with James Conner over the last couple of years. He's got the occasional good game, but he does not factor into the passing game, and he is not a workhorse back. So for the most part, you can ignore Snell on draft day. As you probably can when you go to Cincinnati and you talk about Samaje Perine. Look, Perine is an okay back, but he's never going to factor in without an injury to Joe Mixon. We do know that. They have been talking up Mixon all offseason in Cincinnati. And fantasy managers have kind of an irrational hatred of Mixon right now. They think they should have seen more from him than they have gotten. And of course, the horrible foot sprain, you're dancing on the sidelines, and then suddenly you're out for the entire season really sticks in their craws. But Mixon is going to get a ton of work in this offense. And even if he got injured, again, sort of like the Giants, we don't want the Cincinnati running back, we want Joe Mixon. So even if he's injured, we're not going to Samaje Perine to look for work absent really deep leagues. At 24, let's go to Carolina, and let's talk about Chuba Hubbard. Because obviously, again, there's no way that Hubbard is going to factor in absent an injury to Christian McCaffrey. Now, we did see Mike Davis, of course, last year take over and have monstrous games for at least most of the season until he faded down the stretch. But Hubbard was a fourth-round pick. It's unlikely that the Panthers are going to just turn their entire offense over to him, like they kind of did with Mike Davis. Hubbard would probably have value if there's an injury to CMC, but it's not as if he's going to be someone who you feel great about starting regardless, so he's not someone to look at on draft day. Nor is Darrington Evans of the Tennessee Titans. Now again, the primary running back in Tennessee has a lot of value because that primary running back is Derrick Henry, not because necessarily it's the primary running back in Tennessee. The offensive line is relatively mediocre, and Arthur Smith is gone, although even if they keep the same type of offense, they added Julio Jones this offseason. They're clearly looking to lean into the pass a little bit more. There are plenty of pass-catching options on the team, so it's not as if Darrington Evans is going to come in there and get either the workload or have the success that Henry did. Finally, let's get to the last name in this tier, and it's Damian Williams in Chicago. Now, obviously, the main other running back besides David Montgomery that you think of in Chicago is Tariq Cohen, who is, of course, battling his own health concerns. But Tariq Cohen is not a handcuff, okay? It's not as if a running back goes down and Tariq Cohen suddenly gets 25 touches a game. He's just not built for that. He will keep his role. Instead, Damian Williams would be the primary beneficiary. But we've seen Damian Williams. He's fine. He succeeded in Kansas City, but that's probably more of the situation, as we'll talk about in a little bit, than Williams' talent. But even assuming that he does take over, Justin Fields is probably going to be the starting quarterback by midseason. And although Williams' efficiency might improve when you have a running quarterback like Fields, it's unlikely that his volume is going to reach a peak. And again, Tariq Cohen hopefully gets healthy as the season goes on, is going to continue to eat into anybody's work there. So again, Chicago is not where you look for a backup running back, though David Montgomery makes a fine pick this year. Next, let's go to the tier that I call low-end contributors who could see a bigger role with an injury. Let's start in Houston at number 21 with Phillip Lindsay. Now, you've got David Johnson, you've got Mark Ingram, you've got Rex Burkhead, and most importantly, you've got the Houston Texans, a team that literally no fantasy managers want any part of this entire year. but Lindsay has alligator blood, okay? He finds a way to compete and produce wherever he goes. And we obviously don't know what's going to happen with this quarterback situation. But if Deshaun Watson starts, then the offense is just not going to be as bad as people think, and the running game should be decent enough. And if he doesn't start, then chances are that the Texans are going to lean into the run even more. That leaves a guy like Phillip Lindsay, who already has some value now. Again, that's what this tier is. He's got some value already. If there's an injury to David Johnson, or if some of his competitors get cut, he's going to be a guy who you might be able to start as a flex most weeks. So don't entirely ignore him on draft day. At number 20, let's talk about J.D. McKissic and the Washington football team. Now, J.D. McKissic is not your classic handcuff. He's much more like Tariq Cohen that we talked about with Chicago. But right now, he's pretty much the only game in town unless you want to talk about Peyton Barber, which you don't and I don't. Now, he can be used in a pinch right now, especially in PPR formats. And he will have a bigger role if there is an injury to Antonio Gibson. But he's not going to be the primary back. So again, this is still not a desirable situation that you want to go after. At number 19, let's go to Miami and talk about Salvon Ahmed. Now, Ahmed did well last year when Myles Gaskin was out, either because of injury or because of COVID. But Myles Gaskin was the dude when he was in that offense, both before his injury and as soon as he came back from his injury. Despite Ahmed doing well, the team showed no inclination to go away from Gaskin. I expect that to largely be the case this year. Now, Malcolm Brown is also there, so that's going to take away some more touches. Ahmed is probably going to factor in a little bit, if for no other reason than the team knows that they have to keep Myles Gaskin healthy for the entire year. But if there is an injury to Gaskin, then Ahmed's stock rises. We've seen Malcolm Brown. He'll have the occasional good game, but he's not going to be the primary runner in this offense. That would be Ahmed. So he's a guy who might provide some low-end value from the start, but a high-end value a little bit if there is an injury to Gaskin. And finally, let's go to Indianapolis at number 18 and talk about Marlon Mack. Now, we saw from the beginning of last year it was going to be more of the Marlon Mack show than the Jonathan Taylor show to start until Mack got injured in the first game of the season. Now, Taylor has earned the starting role. I don't want to hear about Tags complaining about his end-of-year schedule. He has earned the starting role, and he was drafted to be the starter. But Mack is going to get carries, even when Taylor is healthy, because that is the way the Colts want to run their offense. And if Taylor does get injured, we know it's not going to be Nyheim Hines who's taking over the bulk of the work. It's going to be Mack. So he's a guy you can draft, potentially start in a deeper league at a flex spot to start. And then also, if there's an injury, he'll have major value. Now let's start getting to the more interesting categories. And I'll call this first one, backups who become studs with an injury. And let's start in Kansas City at number 17 with Darrell Williams. This is all about the Chiefs offense. As you know, we talked about Damian Williams, and he is a fine running back, but a lot of his success was due to the fact that he was in Kansas City. Other backs like Jerick McKinnon, Darwin Thompson, they're not going to be the primary guys should anything happen to Clyde Edwards-Helaire. By default, the guy who is the primary running back in Kansas City is going to have a ton of value. And right now, absent an addition, that's going to be Darrell Williams. Again, not a guy you absolutely have to draft immediately, but in terms of outlook, he is one of the better ones that you can think about, as is number 16 in Seattle, Rashad Penny. Now, the reports on Penny's health right now are good, and it looks like he's really motivated to do well after the Seahawks declined his fifth-year option. Don't forget that a couple of years ago, before Penny suffered the injury that basically knocked him out all of last year, Penny was on the verge of overtaking Chris Carson in that offense. He had a couple of really good games, looked to be going, and then suffered the bad injury. Penny is a guy who the Seahawks spent major draft capital on. Whether or not you agree with that decision, that's how they valued him. So he's talented enough to be a must-start option if anything were to happen to Chris Carson, who, as we have seen, really struggles to stay healthy for a full season. But even if not, even if Carson does stay healthy, then Penny's probably going to factor in regardless. He's a guy who's basically being ignored in drafts right now, and he really should be taken in pretty much anything 12 teams or deeper. At number 15, let's go to Minnesota and talk about one of the primary handcuffs that everybody thinks about when they think about handcuffs, and that's Alexander Mattison. Now, I know, Mattison got his shot for a little bit last year. He did not do well with it. Throw it out. It's okay. This happens sometimes with running backs who just step into a situation that looks like gold and it just doesn't turn out to be. In that offense, with that system, that is a prime spot for any running back, and Madison is talented. Now, he's not going to factor in very much with Dalvin Cook there, obviously, but Cook has been banged up. That's what happens when he takes the amount of volume that he's seen. So he is going to excel if he gets a long-term look in that offense. And he's a guy who obviously you draft and you just stash on your bench without starting. And if there is an injury ahead of him, he becomes a must-start option. Just like our next guy at number 14, which is Tony Pollard from Dallas. You don't need me to explain this to you. We have seen what happens when Ezekiel Elliott goes down with an injury, which is Tony Pollard becomes a guy who can single-handedly win you a week in fantasy like he did last year. The Dallas offense, as long as Dak Prescott is healthy, which right now is a bit of a question mark, but the Dallas offense is going to be elite, as it usually is. He's not Zeke, okay? We know that about Tony Pollard. He's not nearly as talented as Zeke is, but he doesn't need to be to provide borderline RB1 value in that offense. So again, he is a guy to target in drafts and stash. But again, he is not a guy who you can absolutely start regardless of what else is going on, like some of the guys in the next category that I like to call backups who already provide value and would become definite startable options with an injury. And let's start with New Orleans, number 13, Latavius Murray. Now you know what Murray is going to give you by now, right? We have seen it. Probably enough volume each week to start regularly as a flex option in a deeper league, particularly in standard formats. And that's especially true with the injury to Michael Thomas. With Thomas gone, don't know whether or not the Saints are going to start Taysom Hill, but they're probably going to lean on the run even a little bit more. Now, if Alvin Kamara gets injured, and again, we have seen this, Latavius Murray becomes an RB1 without a doubt. So draft him to start him as a low-end flex option, but also somebody who has huge upside should anything happen to the running back in front of him. At number 12, let's go to Detroit, and let's talk about Jamal Williams. So we know from Anthony Lynn's comments that this is not just the DeAndre Swift show now as much as everybody wants it to be. And we've seen from Anthony Lynn's system that he is not going to rely on just one running back, particularly when that one running back like Swift excels as a pass catcher. Williams is going to get a lot of volume probably right from the start. So he's going to be a guy who you can throw in there in your flex. But if something happens to Swift, he immediately becomes a guy, even in an offense like Detroit, which I understand is not going to be good, doesn't matter. He will make up for that with the volume that he will get if something happens to Swift, and that's why he falls in at number 12. At number 11, let's go to Arizona and talk about James Conner. Now, I am not sure where this idea came from that Chase Edmonds has enough to be an every down back. And I don't know why fantasy managers are kind of treating him that way in drafts. He has had more than 8 carries 3 times in his entire career, okay? That's it. The worry with Conner is his health. It's not his talent. He's actually been one of the most successful goal line backs that we have seen, especially last year. So he is going to get the goal line work. I am confident in that. And he's going to be a guy who you can probably start, generally speaking. But if something happens to Chase Edmonds, then you've got a guy who, again, you can start as an RB1 so long as he is healthy. That's the rub. We don't know how long he'll be healthy. But either way, as long as he can start with Chase Edmonds there, and certainly has his stock go way up if Chase Edmonds is injured, he's a guy to target on draft day. At number 10, let's go to Oakland and talk about Kenyon Drake. Now, Josh Jacobs is a fine runner for sure, but he was always splitting work with Jalen Richard and DeAndre Washington. Now you have a guy who the Raiders targeted and paid decent money to in Drake. Drake is also a really good goal line back, just like Jacobs is, admittedly, but he factors more into the passing game. So in PPR formats for sure, but even in half PPR formats, Drake is a guy who you're going to be able to get away with starting most weeks because he's probably going to see borderline double-digit touches regardless. If anything does happen to Jacobs, we've seen Drake be able to carry the load at least for a short amount of time over a season. So he's a guy to, again, target as one of your handcuffs. At number 9, let's talk about the Jets, and I'm going to list Michael Carter as the handcuff right now, because I think Tevin Coleman is probably going to be listed as a starter whenever the Jets release their official depth chart, which they have not as I record this. But Carter is really the only running back that you are going to want to target in that offense, okay? The offense is probably not going to be quite as bad as people think. The offensive line has been rebuilt. Zach Wilson is going to make things interesting, especially with his ability to run. And again, any running back getting a significant amount of touches in almost any offense has value. Now, Carter is going to need to separate himself, but the regime targeted him in this draft. That is what happened. It's a new regime. That says something about it. So whether we're talking about LaMichael Pirine or Tevin Coleman, if there's an injury, Carter is going to shoot up in value. And he's a guy to stash on your bench and can even start if you're in a pinch. At number 8, let's go to Jacksonville and talk about James Robinson. Now, Robinson's ADP is still way too low, okay? But he is the handcuff right now to Travis Etienne. That's just the way it works. But even with Etienne getting a ton of work, remember, the Jaguars talked about how they were really targeting Kadarius Toney at that spot. They want somebody who's going to factor into the passing game more than the running game. Now, that could be just talk, but again, Etienne is not going to come into this situation and just dominate the touches completely in the running back spot. Certainly James Robinson, who, again, is not a guy that this regime was probably thinking about. Wasn't a guy that the last regime was thinking about either, but he showed that he can get the job done if necessary. And if something does happen to Etienne, he's going to shoot up in value like all these other guys. So he's a guy, again, who you can probably get away with starting as a borderline flex regardless of what happens to the starter in front of him. But if Etienne gets injured, then he's going to be a must-start option as an RB2. Next, at number 7, let's go to Buffalo and talk about Zack Moss. Now, no one wants Zack Moss to be a thing more desperately than I do. But Josh Allen continues to score all the rushing touchdowns, and the Bills just do not seem inclined to get rid of Devin Singletary, who probably is going to be listed as the starter as we head into the season. But even with all this, Moss should probably carve out a role where he's getting double-digit touches every single game. And if something happens to Devin Singletary, then you're going to be looking at maybe 20 touches per game or something like that. Moss is really, really talented, and if he gets the opportunity, he can excel, even with Josh Allen stealing a lot of the goal line work. At number 6, let's go to Tampa Bay and talk about Leonard Fournette. Forget playoff Lenny, okay? That's a cool thing that happens just in the playoffs. It's not going to happen during the regular season. Ronald Jones is almost certainly going to be listed as the quote-unquote starter and probably get the majority of the carries. But Bruce Arians still wants a committee. He's been pretty public about that, and the Bucs could have let Fournette walk. They did not have to re-sign him whatsoever. They would have been fine in that running back room, especially with them adding Gio Bernard. Now, Bernard does cap Fournette's ceiling a little bit, but Fournette was not factoring into the passing game all that much regardless. So either way, it's not as if that changes what the situation would be if Ronald Jones got injured. Now, for now, Fournette is probably a guy who's going to see enough volume, like Moss, probably threaten double-digit touches per game. And if anything happens to Jones, he's going to be the primary guy by default. And that makes him worthwhile as a stash, and maybe as a guy that you can start in deeper leagues right off the bat. Finally, let's talk about A.J. Dillon in Green Bay. We have seen Jamal Williams excel as the 1B to Aaron Jones's 1A in that offense. And you know, again, that this regime liked Dillon enough to draft him at the expense of getting Aaron Rodgers any conceivable pass catcher that might help him, win a Super Bowl. So what's going to happen now with Williams gone? Well, I can tell you that A.J. Dillon is probably going to see a lot of goal line work. That's what he's kind of built for. So he's going to probably be scoring some touchdowns right out of the gate, which makes him valuable from a fantasy standpoint. But if something happened to Aaron Jones, I don't even know how high somebody like Dillon would go. Probably not, he'd probably be top 10, frankly, if we're speaking honestly, because he'd get so much volume, and again, the goal line work, that he'd be somebody who, again, adds that part of being valuable right out of the gate, and also has enormous upside should anything happen to the starter in front of him. All right, let's finish up here with the final category, and that's already startable flexes with league-winning upside. Let's start in Baltimore with Gus Edwards. Now, if you roster Gus Edwards, you probably have a bigger appreciation for him than almost any other fantasy manager because he is always efficient. He's averaged 5.2 yards per carry throughout his career. And again, the volume is never there. And really, they don't want it to be there. The way Baltimore, who runs more than anybody else, wants it to be is Lamar Jackson and at least 2 running backs, this time J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards, sometimes more than that, obviously, as we've seen with Mark Ingram. But if something happens to J.K. Dobbins this year, Gus Edwards is probably going to be a 20 touch per game back. And with his efficiency, which by the way would not go down, I don't think, even if he got more work, he could be huge. We know his floor right now, even with the other running backs, is roughly 135 to 140 carries per season. That's what he's gotten each of the 3 years of his career. And that's enough to be a startable option, and particularly in standard leagues, but even half PPR leagues. But again, if J.K. Dobbins were to get injured, then Gus Edwards would be not just a must-start option, but a strong RB1. At number 3, let's go to San Francisco and talk about Trey Sermon. This is San Francisco, so who the heck knows what exactly they're thinking right now? But what we do know is that they like to have multiple running backs in their system, which is what makes Sermon somebody who's going to have value right out of the gate, because you know he's going to get touches. We've seen this forever with Matt Breida and Raheem Mostert and Jerick McKinnon. So even if Mostert does get the start, you know Sermon, who again was just drafted, is somebody who they want to be a part of this offense. And if Mostert does get hurt, we have seen the occasional runs here, like we did with Mostert, where when the other guys in the offense are hurt, one of the guys does step up and randomly has a stretch where they're getting 15 touches per game and they're dominating. That could be Sermon, who again, this regime obviously likes, and so he's a guy to target certainly as a backup who could have bigger value later on in the season, but somebody who should provide value right out of the game. As will Javonte Williams, the number 2 handcuff in Denver. Now look, he's going to get work, okay? He's going to get work right from the start. He's going to have more value later on in the season regardless of anything that happens to Melvin Gordon. You don't need an injury. He's a guy who's going to be able to contribute for sure. We saw this with Phillip Lindsay. We know that the Broncos do not want one running back in their system. They want multiple guys. Now, I'm not personally keen on Williams overtaking Melvin Gordon entirely. I know there are analysts out there that are. That's not me. Okay, I think when you have an established veteran like Gordon, it is very difficult for a rookie to come in and just take over the role absent an injury. So for everybody expecting him to just be this dominant force that's going to show Melvin Gordon the door, I don't think that's the case. Gordon is still a talented runner despite getting up there in age. But if something does happen to Gordon, that's when you have a superstar on your hands. So certainly Williams is a guy worth drafting. He'll get enough volume to make it worthwhile. And again, superstar potential should anything happen to the running back in front of him. And finally, your number 1 running back handcuff. This is not a surprise to anybody who plays fantasy football. It's Kareem Hunt in Cleveland. This is obvious. He finished as the RB10 in half PPR formats last year. He is startable as a strong flex right out of the gate, even as an RB2, particularly in PPR leagues, but even half PPR leagues for sure. If Nick Chubb does get hurt, he is an RB1. He might have quote-unquote disappointed last year when he got that start, just because you kind of expected him to go from splitting work with Chubb and being incredibly valuable to basically challenging for the number 1 spot when Chubb did go out. That didn't happen, but still, given the fact that how much the Browns run the ball, 48%, 4th most in the league, you know that Hunt is going to have a ton of value with or without Chubb. Without, really, he's one of the elite backs in the league and would challenge for top 5 status this year. So that's going to do it for ranking all 32 running back handcuff situations. Again, people feel very differently about ranking all the handcuffs. Some people love to target handcuffs, some people don't. I kind of fall somewhere in the middle. The stronger guys I'm willing to take a risk on, but other than that, you're just holding a roster spot hoping for an injury, and it's a dangerous way to play fantasy football. In the meantime, hope you enjoyed the video, and please subscribe here to our YouTube channel here at youtube.com/FantasyPros. And don't forget to follow us everywhere on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at FantasyPros so you don't miss any of the great content that we're going to be producing all season long.